How will the US economy shape its presidential election? Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump pledge strong policies if elected in November. But as the country is reeling from a huge deficit and high consumer prices, what can either of them offer? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Welcome to a special US election edition of Inside Story. With 2 months to go before the vote, candidates are outlining their economic vision. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris says she plans to cut some taxes and launch a massive house-building program, while former President Donald Trump says he'll slash what he says is unnecessary federal spending and put large tariffs on foreign imports. The economy and inflation are top priorities for voters, as many are struggling to make ends meet. So how will the state of the economy play into the election in November? And what role will swing states play in the outcome? We'll explore all of this with our panel of guests who join us in a moment. But first, this report from Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
Outlining his economic vision for the U.S., former President Donald Trump says he'll cut federal spending and the corporate tax rate for companies that manufacture within the country. He also says tech billionaire Elon Musk has agreed to serve in his administration if he wins in November.
I will create a government efficiency commission tasked with conducting a complete financial and performance audit of the entire federal government and making recommendations for drastic reforms. We need to do it. And Elon, because he's not very busy, has agreed to head that task force.
Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris is highlighting different economic policies, including a $25,000 credit for first-time homebuyers and tax cuts.
We will pass a middle-class tax cut that will benefit more than 100 million Americans.
While unemployment in the U.S. is low, inflation remains high, and frustration among the public will likely show up in the polls.
There needs to be a kind of careful balancing between touting accomplishments and recognizing the pocketbook challenges that many voters still feel. It's not just the state of the economy, it's voters' perceptions that matter.
Most opinion polls give Harris a slight advantage, but Trump is close behind. And recent surveys suggest voters trust the Republican Party more to manage the economy.
Right now, whether you're looking at the national polling numbers or you're looking at the swing state polling numbers, you have to say that the momentum is with Kamala Harris. This race is, today, still a toss-up. But I'd rather be Kamala Harris than Donald Trump, given the directional arrow of the polls.
A televised presidential debate next week could be a turning point, with both parties highlighting the other's weaknesses and their individual approach to the economy. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this with today's panel of political and economic experts joining us on Inside Story. In Washington, D.C., Eric Ham, a political analyst and co-author of the GOP Civil War, Inside the Battle for the Soul of the Republican Party. Robert Scott, independent economist. He's joining us from Rockville, Maryland. And Dimitris Valatsas is chief economist and founding partner at Aurora Macro Strategies. He's joining us from New York. So we're talking about the election campaign today and the economy. It's the economy, stupid. That's the famous expression from James Carville, who was the advisor to Bill Clinton back in the 1992 election. Robert, does that still apply? It's the economy, stupid. And in terms of this election, are we talking about all economic issues, or is it very specifically inflation, prices and the cost of living?
I think it's all economic variables. Certainly inflation is high in the minds of many voters. But I think the overall status of the economy is critical. And whether or not the Federal Reserve succeeds in achieving a soft landing for the economy. Today, we had a good jobs report. That's helpful. But we've had rising unemployment now for 6 or 8 months, and that's a bad indicator. So we don't know how the economy is going to look to voters, particularly 2 months out from now when they actually go to the polls.
Eric, there are so many issues in a US election campaign. You would probably agree, economy stands there at or near the top. But rank it for me. What are the other key issues, and where would you say that they are in voters' minds? Healthcare, abortion, crime, climate, gun control, the character of the presidential candidate, and for our audience, many of whom are outside the US, foreign policy. Where do those things rank?
Well, I think they all rank pretty high, particularly the issues of healthcare and women's reproductive rights. But of course, those issues also feed into this issue of the economy and rising inflation, which has been a nagging problem for the Biden-Harris administration, as well as for voters. And I think we're going to continue to see this be a top issue throughout this campaign over the next 60 days. And while certainly many Americans will be making their choice based on the economy, clearly what they are looking for and what they are yearning for is which of these candidates is going to present the best economic vision, not only for the country, but more importantly, for the pocketbooks of many Americans.
Dimitris, in terms of inflation, in June 2022, prices were rising by 9.1% a month. Now inflation has come down to about 2.89, I think is the latest figure. But that's not reflected, is it, in ordinary people's perception of the situation?
That's a fair point to make. I mean, the Federal Reserve has clearly done an excellent job of bringing down inflation without causing too much trouble in the labor market. But, people have longer memories than just the last 12 months of price data, and they look at the levels of prices, perhaps more than they do at the annual increase. And when they compare where they are today in terms of the prices they're paying for groceries compared to where they were at the last election, that impression of high inflation has not gone away, despite, as you mentioned, the progress that the Federal Reserve has made in bringing price pressures down.
Robert, I mean, that's the problem in terms of the public. When they talk about inflation, they're really talking about prices. Inflation means the amount that prices are going up. And of course, no economist wants prices to go down because deflation is a really bad thing. But people are I think, affected by the cumulative effect of this. And they remember that when President Biden came into office, it was just 3.5 years ago. And the things they buy in the supermarket then compared with now, they're about 20% more in terms of what they're paying for them.
That's exactly right. And I think the two most important measures of prices are grocery prices and housing prices, which of course driven by interest rates. So these are factors I think that are high in the minds of most voters. And there's not a lot that Kamala Harris can do to convince them that those prices are going to come down. That would be an unreasonable and harmful expectation. So we have to deal with the reality that prices are substantially higher now than they were 4 years ago.
Dimitris, if we look at the stewardship of the economy by the Biden administration and by the Federal Reserve and its control of interest rates, how would you judge that? Because if you look, say, 18 months or so, or 2 years ago, people were talking about the real likelihood of a recession. And actually, there's been what economists call a soft landing, it seems. And some might say this is actually the best case scenario that Biden and Harris could have hoped for.
I would broadly agree with that, but I would probably break up the tenure of the Biden administration into two. And let's use the 2022, when the Fed started hiking rates as our cutoff there. In the first year of the administration, President Biden presided over increasing inflation, probably excessive fiscal spending that fueled that inflation to some degree in the midst of a COVID recovery. And I think the record for both fiscal policymakers, and obviously this includes Congress, and for monetary policymakers at the Federal Reserve was not very good and led to this inflationary overshoot. However, the 2 years that followed, I would definitely give the Federal Reserve very high marks for managing to engineer inflation coming back down without causing unemployment to spike. And I would also give the administration high marks for not interfering too much with the job of the Federal Reserve, which has a mandate for maximum employment and price stability. I think they've broadly done very well in that regard. One thing that is important to look out for as we head into this election, of course, is the federal deficit, which, broadly speaking, is out of control, and none of the candidates has a clear plan to bring it back under control.
Eric, do you think behind the scenes there may be some frustration among the Harris camp and within the Biden administration that they haven't got the credit for avoiding the recession that many had predicted?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, but I think a lot of that has to do more with the Biden-Harris administration simply not touting their economic record. This is an administration that has produced more jobs than any other administration over the last 3 decades. In addition to that, we know that the U.S. economy has certainly outpaced any other economy in the world. And so clearly what we're seeing is under the Biden-Harris administration, there have been a number of jobs that have returned to the United States, particularly with more corporations and companies now building semiconductors in the United States, as well as a very real effort to try to keep prices low, which is why we are seeing the Harris campaign attempting to go after companies for price gouging. Because while we certainly look at this issue of inflation, we know that corporations have certainly tried to benefit from that as well. In fact, one major grocery chain has even admitted to actually hiking prices as a result of the rise in inflation.
As we head towards the election, which is now less than 2 months away, there are, it seems, some important bits of information and decisions coming ahead. One of the bits of information is the jobs report, which has come out recently. That shows the data that 142,000 jobs were added in August. That's nearly 30,000 more than July. Unemployment slipped slightly, standing at 4.2%, according to the Labour Department. Robert, are those figures good or bad, would you say?
Well, I think they're very good. I mean, continuing to add jobs despite the pressure that's being imposed and has been imposed by the Federal Reserve for the past 5 years, the past year or two, I think is very good news. But I think the other thing to keep in mind in this discussion, I don't think the candidates have made this point enough, is that inflation is not just a U.S. problem. It's global. It was caused primarily by supply chain problems coming in during the COVID crisis and afterwards, and by the war in the Ukraine, which has resulted in tightened supplies of food, grains, and energy supplies. Those are precisely the things that are going up too fast. The other factor is, of course, corporate profiteering. As mentioned, corporate profits are up sharply over the past 3 or 4 years. So companies have taken advantage of the COVID price pressures to increase their returns.
So that jobs report is one important milestone. The other, I believe, comes up on the 17th and 18th of this month, when the Federal Reserve will be meeting to decide on interest rates. Given that jobs report, what do you think that Jerome Powell and his colleagues are going to do, Dimitris?
I think today's report solidifies the case for a rate cut, which has been well telegraphed by both Jay Powell and other members of the FOMC, which sets interest rates here in the United States. There's a little bit of debate in the markets of whether that's going to be 25 basis points or 50 basis points reduction in interest rates. Today's jobs report, I think, was strong enough to justify the Fed starting slow, starting with 0.25%, and then seeing how it goes over the rest of the year. But I think the case for lowering interest rates has been well made, both by market participants, by the data, and by members of the Federal Open Market Committee. So I would expect a cut to come in 2 weeks' time.
Eric, as Kamala Harris tries to sell her economic policies, we know that the Republicans so far in this campaign have had the advantage in the polls on economy. How hard or how easy is it for Harris to separate herself from Biden's economic record? She's trying to portray herself as the change candidate.
Well, while she's trying to make that argument that she is the change candidate, clearly what we're seeing is a candidate who is also continuing to double down on the policies from the Biden-Harris administration with a focus on the working and middle class. And of course, her latest proposal on more affordable housing built throughout the country, I think that would certainly be a massive boon. That's, I think, been one of the major sticking points, particularly for young people rising and moving into the middle class, is the lack of affordable housing across the country. And if that's actually a move that a Harris administration, if elected, could actually implement, I think that would go a very long way in solidifying not only a growing and robust economy, but certainly, I think, a successful presidency for the Harris-Walz team.
Well, let's look at some of the policies, and housing is one of them, Dimitris. Harris, as we heard Eric say, is pledging to build 3 million new homes during her first term, but she's also going to give first-time buyers $25,000 towards a down payment. Now, some economists have criticised that, saying that that's just going to mean there's going to be increased demand and sellers are going to raise their prices.
I think, as with everything, demand-side policies carry a risk of inflation with them, and when you give everyone a subsidy, regardless of the amount, you can expect some of that to flow through to house builders and sellers. And I don't think I think that's a fair critique. We've seen demand-driven policies in other parts of the world, in the UK and Canada and New Zealand. And in general, I would say they have succeeded more in raising house prices than they have succeeded in raising rates of house building. And that's something I would look at very carefully, either as the Kamala Harris economic team or, whatever congressional approval is required for that. The international evidence is not particularly robust for these kinds of subsidies.
Dimitris, one of the things that Trump, on the other hand, wants to do, he says, that will improve the economy, is to have a government efficiency commission, where he says, I quote here, that he wants an audit of the entire federal government and wants them to make recommendations for drastic reforms. Now, the interesting thing about this is who he's put in charge of it, because he's put Elon Musk, the boss of Tesla, the boss of X that used to be Twitter. Of course, I would imagine that there are some US civil servants who are quaking in their boots about this, given that Musk laid off 6,000 people, 80% of Twitter's workforce, when he bought the company.
Well, I'm not a civil servant. I wouldn't want to speak for the civil servants working for their country. It's a standard, I would say, Republican proposal that the federal government is bloated, has too many people doing too many things, and it needs to be slimmed down and do fewer things. As a macroeconomist, I'm somewhat less concerned about the size of the administration. I don't think that's where the deficit problems this country has begin and end. So I wouldn't hold my breath to see the macroeconomic impact of that. If I had to guess, I would imagine the impact would be fairly limited on the macroeconomy.
Robert, staying with Trump's plans, obviously part of the strategy with everything with Trump is America first. And in economic terms, that means putting tariffs on products imported from abroad. He's floating the idea of a 10% universal tariff on all imports from abroad and hitting those goods coming from China with a 60% tariff. What do you make of that? Is that going to work, or is that just going to fuel further inflation?
I think it's purely inflationary. Evidence has shown that tariffs are not effective at reducing imports or stimulating demand for domestic goods. The core problem with American goods is that we're not price competitive, and that's in part driven by the fact that the dollar is so high, it's so strong in the global economy. So I think that's a problem. And I think you have to think about the dollar and the competitiveness frankly, from the frame of what are the larger macroeconomic plans of these two campaigns. Trump has proposed retaining his corporate tax cut at a cost of perhaps $5 trillion over the next decade. On top of that, the tariffs, as you mentioned, are going to cost consumers anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 per family. So these are huge costs to impose, burdens to impose on the economy. I expect that those tax cuts alone are going to boost the government deficit and raise the cost of borrowing. On the other hand, I think the Biden administration is going to retain those taxes and invest part of the receipts in things like child care tax credits and tax credits for children, particularly from low-income families. So the priorities are very different. And I think those kind of macro priorities will lead to lower interest rates and a smaller deficit for the Harris-Walz administration than for Trump, who was going to expand the deficit by cutting taxes. So I think it's important to step back and look at it from that broader lens.
Do we also, Eric, though, have to step back and look at these things which are supposed to be economic policies and look at them more politically? That yes, they're not necessarily all about the credible economic plan. They're about things that are eye-catching for voters. For example, Harris, we've just heard about Trump on tariffs. Harris knows inflation is a weak spot for her, and she suggested a proposal to ban price gouging on groceries.
Yeah, that's right. And we know that that's an issue that she is making her case to the voters. But look, going back to Donald Trump and these tariffs, we've actually seen this play out during his administration, where he placed tariffs on goods coming from China as well as from Turkey. And I think what we've seen how that played out, it didn't really bode well for the American consumer then, and it certainly will not at this time. But of course, Donald Trump seems to believe that this is actually a boon for the United States, and it punishes these foreign countries, but he doesn't seem to make the case in terms of it diminishes the buying power of U.S. consumers. And so I think that's something that we have to also continue to see play out. It's also important to note, we've also heard from Goldman Sachs that weighed in on both of these two candidates and what they believe that their policies will do for the economy. We've heard from Goldman Sachs that says that they believe that a Harris-Walz campaign will actually be a boon for the economy, whereas they believe that Donald Trump, with his tariffs, would actually slow economic growth for the United States.
Dimitris, it's all very well, all of these policies that are proposed by these candidates, but there's another factor in US politics, which is who controls Congress. And Harris may not be able to put any of these policies in place if she loses the Senate, and the Democrats look pretty weak in that race.
I think that's a fair point. It's actually something that people tend to underestimate. The U.S. is, of course, electing a president in November, but it's also electing a third of the Senate and the entirety of the House of Representatives. And the power of the purse, decisions over how much to tax and how to spend, lie with Congress. They don't lie with the president. So it will be just as important, if not more important, than who ends up in the White House to look at what is the congressional composition going to look like. The Democrats have a very tough map ahead of them. They stand to lose one seat in West Virginia, which means if they win the presidency, control of the Senate will come down to who wins in Montana. And the incumbent there, John Tester from the Democratic Party, he's trailing in the polls. Now, he's not trailing by much, so I wouldn't dismiss out of hand the idea that the Democrats could emerge from this election with control of all three houses that would enable Kamala Harris to push forward her economic agenda. But what is more likely is that we will end up with divided government, regardless of who ends up in the White House. And what that means is there's going to have to be compromise. There's going to have to be some bipartisan agreement over how to deal with the deficit, how to deal with the tax cuts that are expiring, how to deal with the debt limit. And that will not just require input from the president, but also from whoever controls the chambers of Congress.
Now, I started our discussion with the maxim, it's the economy stupid. Another one in US campaign politics normally is presidential debates don't move the needle. But of course, we saw what happened at the end of June, Eric. How much how important is the debate coming up in just a few days' time, and how important will the economy be in that debate?
I don't think this debate is going to matter at all in terms of the subject matter or the economy. I think this is going to be a fight over stagecraft and optics. Many people are going to be watching to see if Kamala Harris can actually withstand the attacks that will certainly come her way from Donald Trump. If she can do that, I think we will then begin to see the polls begin. We will begin to see some separation in the polls. But make no mistake, this is a debate that is all about Kamala Harris, just as much as in June, that debate was all about Joe Biden. Many people were watching to see if, in fact, age was going to be an issue, and it certainly was during that debate. Many people are going to be watching to see if Kamala Harris can actually look and act and appear to be like a commander-in-chief on that stage. And if she can pass that test, then I think voters will reward her with that.
Robert, we've been talking all about finance and economics in this discussion, but of course there's economics in getting elected as well, isn't there? And these figures are interesting. The figures for August, Vice President Harris raised $361 million. That's nearly 3 times what former President Trump raised in that month.
I think that's correct. And I think Kamala Harris's selection and a nomination by the Democratic Party creates a tremendous amount of enthusiasm amongst the voters. Many of them have been sitting on the sidelines, and including many of the wealthy individuals who had been withholding contributions from the Biden campaign. So I think it's a combination of a breaking of the dam, those contributions coming into the Democrats, as well as increased enthusiasm for Kamala Harris.
Thanks to all 3 of you, our guests today, Eric Ham, Robert Scott and Dimitris Valatsas. We'll be putting the spotlight on the campaign regularly on this programme between now and Election Day, November the 5th. Remember, you can also find plenty of US political analysis on aljazeera.com. We want your views too. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here in this chair very soon. But until then, from me and all the team, bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.